All right, folks, here we go. Chapter 20, Ethics and the Modern Communication Professional. Now, before we even get going with this, let's talk about the why of it all. Why should we even study ethics? Why should we care? Let's talk about some myths. First, preaching at me is not going to make me a better person. Well, here's the thing. The goal of studying ethics is to keep you and your organization out of needless trouble and to avoid hurting someone by accident. So any person that has any sense of morality to them or a sense of trying to do the good thing, to do a good thing, is going to care somewhat about ethical standards and ethical approaches. Secondly, radio stations and other public places, have codes of ethics, so all I have to do is read the fine print. These regulations can easily be circumvented by someone who is clever enough to thread the needle, adhering to the letter of the law, but producing a malicious or self-serving outcome. So, in many circles, we talk about the idea of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, where you could technically be in the right in what you do, but the intentions behind what you're doing, the attitude behind what you're doing, is rather nefarious. So just following the codes may not necessarily be enough. The goal of studying ethics is to become knowledgeable about what is standard practice in the industry, so that you will, at the very least, have some basic knowledge that you can use to make a crucial decision under conflicting constraints of time, profit, and peer pressure. Sometimes the answer is not clear-cut, so having some sort of a philosophy behind what you do, the why of what you do, being able to rationalize this particular principle over another, that's going to be very important for your own sake, for the sake of the organization that you're a part of. Third, everybody knows right from wrong. There's no point in going on and on and on about ethics. Well, see, here's the thing. The reason for studying ethics is to learn enough about alternate paths so that you can reach a decision that you can live with. And the thing of it is, not everyone agrees on what is right and what is wrong. We don't all necessarily follow the same standard. And even if we do follow a certain basic standard, the degree to which something may be more right or more wrong, that's going to be different from person to person. See, there's often going to be good and bad outcomes that evolve from your actions. What we're trying to do in thinking about ethics on a more critical level, we're trying to seek out the most honest and humane alternative. So again, because these things aren't necessarily clear-cut, it's not always going to be the same answer and the same standard for every situation at every point in time in history. There has to be some sort of rationale behind what we do, and we should be thinking about that. Misconception number 4, ethics is all situational. Well, the critics of ethics education say that people will justify whatever suits their own interests and that everyone's ethics are different. However, there are common values not only in American society but among societies worldwide. So, kind of the opposite argument of what we were just talking about. There are some things that the vast majority of people are going to hold as a certain standard, and it's important to know what those are, and we should at least consider giving those things priority. Misconception number 5, ethics is just some ivory tower stuff debated by people who have too much free time. Well, you can overcome incidents of monumental stupidity, but an incident that gives you the reputation of dishonesty can be a lifelong scarlet letter. There is practical implications to the discussion of ethics and taking it seriously. And then finally, I'll pick up all this stuff on the job. You want to try to avoid learning from your mistakes as much as you can, because sometimes that can be very costly. Meanwhile, if you look at past case studies and situations, learn from the other mistakes that are out there that have already been made by others, that can be done without damage to your own reputation. So what is ethics? Now that we've talked about the importance of studying ethics and having some sort of consideration of it, let's define it. The broadest definition of ethics is that it's a branch of philosophy dealing with questions of right and wrong human conduct. So now we have another term, philosophy. What is philosophy? Philosophy itself is the study of questions dealing with the state of human existence. You can say that in particular, a lot of what we talk about in philosophy tends to deal with metaphysics, and that's a section of philosophy that deals with the question why. So a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to ethics and philosophy is dealing with the why question. In more common usage, we use ethics as a synonym for principles that govern good behavior. Doing what's right becomes being ethical, and obviously with that idea, wrong would be unethical. Note that ethics and laws are not the same thing. Here's the difference. Laws deal with specific rules that carry a sanction if the rules are broken. Now, the things that the government lays down that are standards, the things that we have to follow. If we don't follow those things, there is some sort of consequence that is carried out by the government or by another entity. Ethics, on the other hand, covers the considerable gray area dealing with right or wrong, and that's the appropriate versus the inappropriate. You could say that this covers, at least to a certain degree, the things that are judged by the court of public opinion or by the court of certain interest groups or certain organizations, depending on the environment that you're in. These things are not necessarily laws. You're not necessarily going to be punished in a legal sense if you do A or B. But there could be consequences from those in your environs if you choose one thing or the other. Now, let's talk about some ideas within ethics. First, the concept of consequentialism. This is an idea that is touted by the likes of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Consequentialists believe that instead of attempting to judge whether an act itself is right, the judgment should be based on the expected outcome of the action. In other words, what is the result going to be, or what is the result that is forecasted to be? And that is what should really be in the forefront of our minds. Let's look at another term, utilitarianism. This is the course of action that produces the greater good for the greatest number of people. So utilitarianism is very much an idea within this concept of being a consequentialist. Consequentialists argue that the ends justify the means and that the end result is what should be used to judge whether or not an action is ethical. So this could mean that someone might judge an action as something that is good or bad in and of itself. But the consequentialist would say, well, that doesn't really matter so much as what was the final result, or what was the intended final result of the action that was done. Non-consequentialism, on the other hand, this was an idea that was touted by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Non-consequentialists believe that motives are the important factor because motives and universal principles don't change from case to case. And you can't invent predicted consequences to justify your actions. So this is a case where people that would say things like the standard is the standard. That is what should really guide what you decide to do and what you decide to not do. Non-consequentialists believe that everyone should adopt a motive-based ethical philosophy and follow principles similar to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Now, Aristotle touted what we consider to be the golden mean. He argued that the right decision often falls on a midpoint that can't be determined by predicting consequences or by sticking to motives. He concluded that good ethics are maintained by rational principle, that principle by which a man or woman of practical reason, someone who shows common good sense, would make a decision. So you're kind of weighing both things here. You take a look at what you want the expected outcome to be, whether that outcome is good or bad, and you're also looking at the standards by which you do the certain thing. So you're looking at both the cause and the desired effect, and somewhere in there is going to be what the ethical course of action is going to be. So, what I want you to do at this point is take a note of these pages here in your textbook, pages 368 through 371. There's a case study in there. And as you read through that, I want you to try to objectively, that means, don't put any of your own bias in there. Try not to bring any of your traditions or premonitions or preconceived notions or anything like that. Look at the case study for its own face value and try to see the pros and the cons of each philosophy of ethics, and then determine in your mind which philosophy seems to make the most sense. We'll talk about that when we get together in class. For now, though, let's move on. Some issues about ethics, or around about ethics as it relates to us in radio. First, there's the issue of privacy. Perhaps the most vexing of ethics issues becomes the consequences to the affected parties. The thing here is that, when we're invading someone's privacy in order to tell a story or create a narrative on radio, it can cause some really personal issues to the person that we're talking about, their friends and family that surround them. And, is that a good thing for the cause of telling the story? Or are we doing more harm than good by using our right of free speech to impede on someone's well-being? Conflict of interest. It's important to not only be free of conflicts, but to give the appearance of being free of those conflicts, because perception can be reality in the minds of an audience. So maybe there is a right way to do something, and there's an ethical way to do something, but it still needs to be weighed whether it's worth doing a certain thing because of what it may look like to those that you're trying to reach. Could have the best of intentions, but if it winds up working negatively in your favor, you have to weigh if that consequence is worth doing the thing that you want to do. Advertiser influence. Advertisers often object to news coverage that runs counter to the best interests of their business, and they may lodge similar complaints about the actions of radio personalities or the choice of their programming. The most ethical professionals do their best to keep a hygienic line between advertisers and operations. In other words, do you crouch or hide a story that may take a look at an advertiser or a prominent business and perhaps put them in a negative light? Do you risk losing those advertiser dollars or risk a boycott of some kind because of the power of that particular company? Or we can even talk about this with particular people. Those are questions that a lot of media companies weigh. Sensationalism. This means appealing to baser tests when attempting to win an audience. Ethical issues, for example, can sometimes arise from contests in which participants are overtly or subtly encouraged to debase themselves. This is just one of many examples here. We tend to talk about this a lot in the internet culture with clickbait, also with just kind of putting out the weirdest of the weird, or the sensationalizing and putting over the top personality traits that are just way out there, or showcasing those that may be seen as outcasts in one way or another. What value is there in that? And some stations may have to decide whether they're going to take a certain approach to covering those stories at all, or if they do, how they're going to cover them, if they would do so with a certain attitude or spin on it that could be seen as sensational, versus doing something that's a little more toned down in the idea of quote-unquote good taste. Anonymity. This is sometimes essential to free discourse because it allows free expression for those who might otherwise be intimidated if their name was associated with their posts. But it also opens the door to cancerous license to malign and ridicule. This is an issue in particular if we're talking about disclosing the names of children in certain situations, or perhaps the victims of abuse in one way or another. There may be those that ask to remain anonymous for fear of retribution for sharing their story, things of that nature. And there's also a government angle to this. The press has long enjoyed the ability to be able to cite unnamed sources for different things. And sometimes the government will put pressure on media outlets to disclose the names of people that they talk to for reasons that they want to use through the legal system. And there's issues that can arise from that in terms of the privilege of the press to be able to use anonymous sources and to get anonymous sources to talk in order to uncover a story. Not just government retribution, but company retribution, retribution from others in the public. All these things are considerations. Bias. When opinionated stances are clear, there is probably no ethical issue unless the biased communication is openly offensive or defamatory. However, ethical consideration is clearly warranted when opinion is passed off as unbiased news. So, is the news story that you're hearing, quote unquote, fair and balanced? Does it lend itself to favor one side of an issue as opposed to another? And why does a story appear to do that? What's the motive behind that? Is it because it's appealing to a societal norm, or is it because it's appealing to a certain agenda? As far as taste is concerned, broadcasting is regulated by the federal government under the theory that the airwaves are public domain, and what goes over them should be inoffensive to all members of the public. The issue becomes cloudier in other forms of communication. So here, this is where we're talking about certain types of quote-unquote obscene content and the way that is regulated over broadcast airwaves. In particular, certain types of language, certain sexual situations, and things like that. But this can even go into things that maybe the government wouldn't regulate per se, but how would it be perceived in the court of public opinion? Now, codes of ethics. You can read more about these in your textbook, but in a real brief sort of sense, many radio organizations will have their own code of ethics. Many times you can find them on the company website. Many stations combine their own code with other existing codes from larger or more representative organizations. You see a list there on your screen of certain places where you may be able to find some of these codes of ethics. And the degree to which those things are followed by individual radio stations or individual media companies is going to vary from place to place to place. And that's going to do it for Chapter 20. We're going to have most of our fun talking about this stuff in class. There'll be a quiz on this chapter where you'll get to explore different issues that may come up, especially from a news standpoint, and think critically about what you would do if you were in a certain situation. But I think we will have fun with your comments and questions when we get together to talk about this chapter.